Welcome back to FTC Insights in 30. I'm your host, Justin Muscolino, CEO of the FinTech Training Center. Today, we're discussing a topic that sits at the center of almost every regulatory issue, every enforcement action, probably every audit finding, and especially in compliance failures, data. So today, we have one of the most foremost experts in Jonathan Flagg. Now, Jonathan is a compliance, financial crimes, and analytics leader with more than 20 years of experience. He worked for JP Morgan, Citi, SMBC. When he was there, he led the AML, transaction monitoring, trade surveillance, and a lot of other groups. So, Jonathan, welcome to the show today. Great to have you.
Thanks, Justin. Great to be here.
All right, so I'm going to kick it off with the first question. And we're going to start with a little of a high level. So, when most people think about compliance, like in terms of policies, procedures, monitoring governance, why has data become such a really important part of today's compliance programs?
Compliance has undergone an evolution over the years. Years ago, it used to be a department staffed mostly by attorneys, and they mostly wrote policies and procedures. But it's evolved into more of a real risk management discipline. And once you treat compliance as a risk, data becomes the center of everything. The policy doesn't matter without evidence. You have to be able to prove that you're executing the policy. And data has to prove that the control works. That's why data has become the real battleground. Risk decisions require measurement, and you can't measure without trusted data. You can't run risk models without trusted inputs. Whether it's transaction monitoring, fraud scoring, or AI analytics, the models are only as good as the data feeding them. And fintechs, which operate at speed, exacerbate the problem. The rapid onboarding, automation, and scale means you can't rely on manual data. You need data-driven visibility embedded into the policy and the process.
So it's like that old phrase, garbage in, garbage out, right?
Absolutely.
Yep, I thought I'd get through a conversation without mentioning that phrase, but it happened. Um, Now, that is pretty cool. But, when you look across like FIs, fintechs, so what are the most common data quality or governance issues that do create risk?
It's the basic things. Let's start with the KYC, the start of the process. If you collect incomplete customer data, you have inconsistent workflows, you have operational data elements that are missing, you're creating blind spots downstream in monitoring, sanctions, and reporting. I also see inconsistent definitions across systems where customer, transaction, beneficial owner, they can all mean different things in different platforms. This, of course, breaks reporting. Fragmented systems without end-to-end lineage, it's this is going to cause problems where your transactions are in one system, your alerts are in another, your case management in another, and you can't trace the customer lifecycle through the systems. Another big problem is unclear ownership. If no one owns the accountability, the completeness of the data, the timeliness or the remediation, it becomes everyone's problem and no one's responsibility. Finally, you have to have good data quality controls. You need good validation rules, reconciliation, and exception reporting. Again, the speed at which fintechs operate make this all more difficult because they have rapid API integrations, vendor onboarding. They're built for speed. They're not thinking about the controls along the way, and they may end up putting in place manual workarounds with spreadsheets and email approvals that just create more of a mess.
And I think another big risk on that when the systems don't talk to each other, and it creates structural problems and a lack of, an audit trail and, obviously what you mentioned as well. I think that's a big point. Now, I'm not going to get into the number of years, but you spend a lot of years evaluating compliance programs at your firms. So, like when regulators identify any type of deficiency, like how often is the root cause like a data problem than an actual policy problem?
Data is almost always a major contributor. It's not the only root cause. I mean, regulators still write MRAs for missing policies or weak controls or so forth. But data often sits underneath or alongside those findings. Data's not going to fix a weak control. If it's designed badly, it's designed
Yeah.
badly. But bad data uh, will make it difficult to detect some of those problems. It turns a small control issue into a broad program issue. That's why in almost every consent order and every set of MRAs, you see data as one of the findings.
Mhm. All right, so we've talked about a lot of negatives so far, which we kind of set the stage for, building an actual defensible compliance program. So, like in your experience, what separates a compliance program that, appears to be effective from one that is actually defensible under regulatory scrutiny?
It's all about the evidence. You've probably heard the phrase a million times. If
Mhm.
it's not written down, it didn't happen. A program is defensible when you can produce clear, consistent, reproducible evidence that the controls are operating as designed. It's so documentation is key. You have to make sure that policies and procedures match your evidence. You're proving that you're actually doing what you said you were going to do. You need the data lineage, as you talked about, Justin. You need the
Mhm.
systems to talk to each other, and you have to be able to trace where the data came from, how it changed, and why it's trustworthy. You need reporting that shows consistency. You have to be able to explain the variances, reconcile numbers across systems. If you can't recreate the metric, the regulators are going to assume that the data is unreliable. And you also have to have good governance on top of this. You need clear ownership of the data, the controls, who owns the remediation, and you have to maintain the evidence for the regulators to see. You can't just say you have management oversight. You have to be able to demonstrate that oversight. You have to be able to show who signed off on what, when, and what evidence they used to sign off.
Because, like you said, if it's not documented, it never happened, right? So,
Exactly.
with all this data, like if I'm in a leadership position, right? So I'm looking at, all this data. I want to find out about trends, themes, issues. What are the key indicators that, compliance and risk leaders really should be looking at or asking for in their reports?
Yeah, that's a great question because a lot of organizations have a lot of metrics and a lot of KRIs, but frankly, most of them that I've seen don't really do much for risk management. I see a lot of organizations putting together metrics that are more operational. They track volumes and counts and activity because it's easy to pull those numbers.
Hmm.
But the KRI has to be tied to the actual risk exposure. It has to measure the change in inherent risk or residual risk. I also see organizations set thresholds arbitrarily, where they're round numbers or they're based on historical norms, and you can't really you have a hard time justifying why the threshold is set that way. It's the threshold has to be meaningful for escalation. It means that if it triggered an investigation or escalation to leadership is warranted. So those are some of the problems I've seen. What KRIs do we need to have? Well, first of all, we need a data quality metric. That's a prerequisite. You have to be able to measure the completeness, accuracy, timeliness. You have to be able to measure the reconciliation rates. The segmentation uh, metrics are key. You have to make sure that customers are segmented into the right bucket because if they're not, all the controls that follow it are invalid. Uh, And we want metrics around things like alert quality, not the number of alerts, like the number of alerts that you've worked in a month, but how many false positives do you have? How many false negatives? It's which alerts actually led to SARS, and things like timeliness and SAR filings, which of course is
Mm.
an important regulatory marker. These are some of the things you want to have in place.
So if you say, for example, I want you to put your crystal ball on for a second. Like you've been around transaction monitoring, you've been around financial crimes programs, you've seen the technology. So where do you, like in the next couple of years, where do you see AML programs really headed?
So let's start with alert optimization.
Mm.
Uh, Historically, organizations produce huge amounts of alerts, and they've put a lot of energy into auto closing the alerts or what have you. But what you want to do is optimize the alerts so that you never create that false positive to begin with. That's key. And then you want to take the alerts you do produce, you want to put them into the right segments. You want to put behavioral clustering around it so that you're handling your alerts properly. Next, AI machine learning, big buzzwords for areas
Yeah.
like transaction monitoring. You want to look for behavioral patterns, not just rule breaches. We're looking to use LLMs for more case summarization, drafting narratives, entity resolution. It's the machine learning isn't going to replace analysts. It's going to complement them, make them more productive. And finally, I would say as these activities become more dependent on things like behavioral analysis, things like machine learning, AML governance really becomes model governance. More focus needs to be put on making sure that your models are tested properly, they have the proper inputs, you're able to explain the, the 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 outputs, you're doing below the line and above the line testing.
Mhm.
All of these good model governance practices become more key.
Did you really think, Jonathan, we get through a conversation without mentioning AI? It
It never struck me for a minute.
Yeah, it doesn't happen these days. Um, Now I want you to put your advice hat on because, our audience are fintech leaders, they're compliance leaders, executives, and they all have the same goal. They want to build a scalable program. So, for your advice, where should they focus first if they want to improve the governance, risk management, and of course, their regulatory readiness?
So I would say one mistake I see a lot of fintechs make is that they focus on the controls first rather than focusing on building the proper governance framework. You need to start with the foundation, which is good governance and good data. So start with defining who owns the data, who's going to own the control, who's going to own the issue remediation. Without the clear roles and responsibilities, you don't have a sustainable program. You want to build the foundation of data, make sure that you know you have the controls in place to make sure it's timely, accurate, complete. Get into the practice of documenting what you do. Again, evidence is key to all this. And then define a meaningful set of KRIs. Again, don't track 200 metrics. You want to have 5 to 10 that actually measure the risk.
You know, that is really good advice. I guess one of my biggest takeaways from this conversations, compliance programs don't fail because they lack policies, really. They fail because organizations lack the governance and the confidence in information they use to manage risk. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining me today and sharing your insights. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, Justin. It's been great talking to you.
And for to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of FTC Insights in Theory. Stay curious, stay disciplined, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.